In this episode of Toolbox, we're talking to Christina Truong, and together we're answering questions about CSS, new features, grid versus Flexbox. We'll even get into Sass and how her psychology major made her a successful technology lead. The pace of the web is relentless, and that's why you need the Toolbox. Hello everyone, this is Ray Villalobos, and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Follow me and subscribe on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube for more content. If you want to watch any past episodes, make sure you take a look at my blog, which is raybo.org. Now you can find an article about today's topic right at the very top, right here. And there should be a link there to the YouTube version of the stream. If you're having any trouble on any of the other social media platforms, you can try YouTube. We primarily also stream on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. Also, make sure you check out my profile on LinkedIn, which looks like this. And what you want to do is make sure that you click on the bell icon if you want to get notifications. I post about once a day on web topics. Now, you can't see this on your own profile, but if you follow me, it should be right here where my edit icon is. And if I go to Christina's, who is the guest today, if I go to her profile, I can see the bell icon right there because I follow her, and I'm going to turn that on so that I get all the notifications. So I have a lot of interesting news this week that I'm going to cover. Usually at the top of the show, I do something called the shorts, which I'm always thinking about rebranding. But a lot of interesting tech news happened this week. So I wanted to cover some of them. And first off is the big announcement of something called Amazon Code Whisper. So this is the answer from Amazon to GitHub about Copilot. So last week we talked to Ronnie Scher about GitHub Copilot, and lo and behold, Amazon just happened to launch a competing product called Code Whisper about a week, not even maybe a week afterwards. So it's pretty similar. I mean, I don't think that they have had as large, as big user testing. They said that they tested it with a lot less users or a significant amount less users, and that this will work with a lot of different code editors. And I think that so it basically continuously examines your codes and gives you contextual information. So if you haven't used Copilot before from GitHub, it's sort of like a super excellent code completion tool. Now, GitHub released it about a week ago, and I think it's like $10 a month or $100 for a year. I'm not sure how much the Amazon version of it is. I'm sure that it's just probably compute time, maybe. I don't know. And one of the things that they mentioned here, which I thought was really funny, is that they really didn't do this. There's no evidence that they did this because the GitHub Copilot was doing theirs, which I got a chuckle out of because they just happened to release it right after Copilot. I'm thinking probably they thought, well, we better hurry before Microsoft and GitHub get all of the industry sort of brain share. So another super interesting thing that I posted about this week was how Facebook is now changing its algorithm to mimic TikTok. Now, one thing that TikTok does better than anyone is how it has allowed people to sort of follow each other and also just engagement. I think what they're super amazing at is maximizing engagement. And so I think that this is a good move maybe from Facebook, but there are some problems. So I posted about this last week. I think that TikTok nailed engagement So it does make a lot of sense, but people have complained in the past about some of the social issues with say Facebook's algorithm. So this is going to be interesting, or an interesting sort of development. I'm pretty sure that TikTok is something people would tend to complain more about. I know that I had a TikTok, and I do have, like, if you go to TikTok Planet of the Web, I've never posted anything. And famously, I think I lasted like about 30 seconds on TikTok because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like mostly, I don't know, horrible stuff. People like going nuts and trying to get engagements. It's really a platform for engagement. So hats off to them. I mean, I think they've nailed engagement better than anyone. And now you're going to see other companies sort of at least try to copy the model or the mechanics of how engagement works in that platform. I read another article about how YouTube Shorts is actually doing pretty well and catching up to the things that TikTok has been doing. But interestingly enough, found a couple of related articles about this as I dug deep into this topic. So BuzzFeed reports that they have some leaked audio from 80 TikTok meetings, and that evidently U.S. user data has been repeatedly accessed from China. So that is really interesting. And you can, I don't know if you can get to the recordings here, but there's a lot of talk about how that is potentially very dangerous. So this is a great article if you want to read it. Again, all the links to any of these sort of things that I'm talking about are going to be in rabo.org. Just go to the article today so you can get a direct link to these places. So not surprisingly enough, then, as I kept on going on this trend, I found out that evidently reported by Yahoo.com, the FCC commissioner urges Google and Apple to ban TikTok from its stores. So this thing is getting more and more interesting. I guess that they didn't like some of the privacy issues that that TikTok has, and so Yahoo News is reporting that now they're actually asking these two companies to stop featuring them in the App Store, and they're giving Apple and Google until July 8th to explain why they aren't removing their app. So the plot thickens on this development, and we'll see what happens. It was such an interesting dive. I read the first article, and I'm like, oh, I wonder about what the recordings were about. So I read the other article, and as I'm looking through it, I learned about this from Yahoo News today. So super interesting. So in lighter news, just not to depress you all with a lot of sort of leaked audio and fights between huge companies that make a lot of money, I did found this really cool site called Hex Words. So hexwords.netify.app. And what's cool about this is that it sort of shows you hexadecimal colors that are also things that you can make into names. So 0FF, you can sort of say that's off, and babies, yeah, bosses. So this is sort of like a list of all of the hexadecimal colors that could be interpreted as words. And there's a lot more than I thought there were, right? This is a huge list. So hopefully there's nothing dubious in here, but holy cow, that's a lot of different words. So ZZZ, I guess the last one is ZZZ. I guess if you're sleeping, okay, that's a little bit of a stretch. 222 is ZZZ. All right. So I thought that was kind of an interesting website. I usually try to bring you a lot more, but I just, with all the stuff from from TikTok and Facebook, I thought I'd at least bring you something interesting. Now, another thing that I wait for every year is this Stack Overflow State of Developer survey that released, I think, about a week ago. So this is a survey of 70,000 developers, and it has a ton of data on the industry. So they ask a lot of questions, and this is probably the biggest developer survey out there. So you're going to find all kinds of interesting stuff in here. So there's stuff on education, and I'm talking to Christina this week about this a little bit, and I thought it was interesting that out of this survey of 73,268 respondents, most of them have a bachelor's degree in either engineering or some sort of master's degree or above. And even then, most of the people who don't also have a university degree, or actually at least they attended some university, have an AA. And, so I think that, you're going to hear it in the interview, but so far I've talked to a couple of people in this series, and I think we felt that, that although I don't think you need to have a degree, but I think you need to assess like what sort of learning do you do best. So, yeah, I think so that information was sort of useful, and I think it has a ton of stuff on technology. So if you want to dig in, the most popular technology that these people use, of course, this is like front end web or full stack web stuff. So you could see JavaScript, HTML, SQL, but then it gets interesting. Python, TypeScript, kind of high up there. Java, I don't use that, but Bash Shell definitely. And you could see sort of out of the developers that they interviewed, what they use, what they like. So most dreaded and most loved, stuff that they have worked with versus wanted to work on. Top paying. So they do have some salary information. It's always a little bit odd because, especially when it's not broken down by area, this can be, just very vague, I guess. But they do break it down in different ways. So you could see sort of by platform, by frameworks. So if you're curious about what frameworks, this will probably give you a good idea of what the sort of different salaries for the different types of technology that you learn. So there's a lot of call for people with some Dino experience. I've never heard of the Play framework or Phoenix. I don't even know. Ruby on Rails. It's kind of interesting. I think like as a technology wanes, there's less developers, so they tend to maybe make a little more money. That's why something like Ruby on Rails is showing up perhaps up high up here because it's harder to find developers, but there's still a need for those developers to do things. And so they have a lot of stuff here about employment, full-time status, some company info, where they are in their careers. I always look at this survey. I feel like this year there's a couple of other surveys that I get a little bit more out of because they're specifically like JavaScript or CSS technologies that they talk about. But this is a great general one, and I think they do well when they talk a lot more about developer and education and other questions. When they break into the specifics of technology, I feel like it's hard for me to gauge a lot of information about, technologies that are popular because there's so much in here. I feel like it needs to be broken down maybe by the type of job. That might be a little bit better. So last week, as you know, I launched this new thing that I'm calling Toolbox Talks, and I did a great interview with Ronnie Scher about Python. Super awesome, super pleased. This week I'm continuing that series, and I'm talking to Christina Truong. I interviewed her. She's actually in the chat and ready to answer your questions. So start putting in questions about CSS that you would like answered. I think I saw something already on the parent selector, whether we're going to get one. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and play the interview I did with her. We actually get into a lot of other stuff. So we get into her career, how she got her start. She's got a great and super interesting story. And I think that you'll find that a lot of people kind of end in development and especially go into teaching with just different mixed ways of getting there. So I always think it's super interesting to find out, how somebody got there. So we start with that, and then we get into just different technologies. And then after the interview, then we'll come back and I'll have her on live and we can ask her some live questions. And hopefully you've put a lot of the questions in the chat as well. So let's go ahead and start the interview, and we'll catch you. I'll be in the chat answering questions, but I'll also catch you right after the interview. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Christina Truong is a web developer and educator from Canada with over 10 years of experience as a front-end developer. As an educator, she's taught over 1,000 students in college courses, boot camps, and workshops. She was the director of curriculum development for Ladies Learning Code, creating workshops for over 20 Canadian chapters. She currently works independently, focusing on inclusive tech education and consulting services. She's also authored what is one of our biggest technology courses at LinkedIn Learning, CSS Essential Training. How's it going, Christina?
Good. How are you doing?
Tell me a little bit about what led you to where you are today.
I kind of fell into it by accident because I was actually in my last year of university and I was studying psychology and communication, so something completely different. And one of my professors, she was just trying to teach us new media and stuff. So we just made a basic website just for hosting like links to our homework and stuff. And I just thought it was really fun, but I didn't really think much of it. And then after I graduated, I just didn't really know what I could do with that degree. And I was sort of bouncing around, ended up getting a temp job as an admin assistant. And one of my big duties was to sort through the mail. And I just found a web design program at one of the colleges. And I was like, well, I'm not really doing much now. And I had some money that I had saved for a car. So I was like, the car can wait. I like this computer stuff. I remember playing around with the website stuff in that one class. And I'm like, I don't know, this seems like it would be fun. Let me just try it. And so it was a certificate program. It was like 14 weeks long. I thought, you know what, this isn't like another 2 to 4 years of my life. Let me just try it. And that was pretty much it. That's how I got into it.
Was there something about that class that you took in school?
I think I was sort of always just kind of interested in technology in general. And then I was also interested in art. So I think when I did that one class and made that website, I was like, oh, I'm basically drawing in a browser. And so it kind of combined my love of art, but into something that actually seemed like it could be a job. And so I think I think that's why I sort of gravitated to front end as well, because I liked the visual aspect of it.
So how did you get from that point of getting like your first, you went to school then for a more focused degree. How do you get to that and to having so many opportunities to like teach others?
After I graduated from the program, I kind of had a pretty linear developer path where the first job I had, I didn't get to do as much coding. We used a CMS at that job. So I was there for a bit, and that was more of just kind of learning how to work in an organization. And then after I left that, I became like a junior developer, intermediate, senior, and then I became like the tech lead for front-end development at my last full-time job. And so that was kind of a pretty straight path from the beginning to senior. But then along the way, there was some buzz around the group Ladies Learning Code was getting started in Toronto. And someone at the organization reached out to me and said, hey, if you're interested, maybe you can come speak at a workshop or something. And I thought, why not? Because I had noticed that even in my developer jobs, I had sort of become like the liaison between the technical folks and the non-technical folks. Like, a PM would come to me, like a project manager, and say, oh, the client is asking for this. How do I explain to them why we can't add this feature or why it takes so long? And I would sort of like help them write the email in a way that explains the technical reasons, but like to someone who's not technical. Or sometimes we would have like the designers or even the project managers kind of help out with like content management. And so I would just show them how to do basic like paragraph tags or adding a link or something, just so that they can kind of like help us with content. And then people would always be like, oh, wow, you make this so easy to understand, or like, you're so good at explaining things. And so I think I kind of kept hearing that, and it just made me feel like, oh, maybe I have like a natural kind of knack for explaining things or teaching. When they reached out to me at Ladies Learning Code to come to a workshop, I'm like, let me just check this out. And then I met some people there. We kept in touch. And then a friend of mine, Pearl Chen, she was leading the first workshop. And after we connected there, she got asked me to do another workshop with her. And it just kind of like spiraled from there. And so I ended up getting involved with that organization and eventually working there full time. And that's when I created the curriculum and all that sort of stuff. And by then I had also started teaching at a college here in Toronto as well, Humber College. And so it just kind of naturally gravitated towards that, from just sort of explaining stuff to people at work to like dipping my toes into teaching a workshop. And then it just kind of escalated from
Well,
there.
that's so interesting, and
Yeah.
and I think that we kind of skipped. I kind of skipped over this in your intro that you actually have
Yeah.
agency experience, and I know that that can
Hmm.
be like a really challenging job, but it's also a really good way of sort of diving in because you tend to like work on a lot of different things. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about like that development of
Hmm.
getting to like understand all the things.
Well, the great thing about working at agencies is you end up working with a bunch of different clients. When you learn stuff, you kind of learn the general overview of how certain things work. When you are put on a project and you have to do more specific things, then you're forced to learn things that you didn't know already to make it work, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
Like CSS preprocessors was a pretty new thing when I was in my agency job. So it was like, oh, we need to find a way where multiple people can work on this at the same time, but then the code looks consistent, but then we want it to be efficient. So then it kind of like forced us to like, oh, let's try these new tools and let's try to find new ways of working on things. That is what I think I really took away from working at these different agencies, is just learning how to work with other people on your team and just the business side of it, I guess, as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that maybe a couple of things that people miss when they're in school is that opportunity to work for a client. I think that that's
Mhm.
lacking. And I really like what you said about how people were saying that you really understood how to explain things or how to do things like that seemed natural to you. I wonder if for you, since you were, psychology major, if you think that that somehow had effect into how you went about like explaining and also maybe talking to clients.
I definitely think so. At first, it seemed weird. Like, how did I end up in this field when this is what I studied? But I think even just the experience of just university in general, like in university, most of the stuff that you learn is much more theoretical. Rather than hands on. So you have to learn how to, well, express yourself better because you're doing more reading, you're doing more writing. But not only that, you have to analyze and you have to critically think about it. And we would do a lot more like long form reading and stuff. So I think it does make sense in terms of how it has affected my teaching, especially doing psychology and communication. So like now I have to think about how do I, explain a concept without being condescending, for example? How do I,
It's a good
you
lesson.
know, or like, because since most of the stuff that I teach is mostly beginner,
Hmm.
I need to find a way to explain it without acting like, shouldn't you know this already? Or being like too beginner, like I'm talking to a child or
Hmm.
something.
Yeah, a
Or
common
even
problem
just
in
be,
developers, like, sometimes they know too much, and I think that they forget what it was like not to know something.
right.
And when you're explaining, I've been to so many talks
Mhm.
where you can tell the person like wrote the code, but they
Right.
forgot what it was like not to know something, and also what the right, understanding like your audience, what the
Hmm.
right level for this audience. Like sometimes you can go faster because the audience is at a different
Right.
level, but that I think is
Right.
really important. So what would you suggest people do today? Like having had, we both had like the college experience,
Hmm.
and you've done a lot of other things in addition to that. You've done boot camps, you've done curricula for
Hmm.
different places. So how do you think people should approach learning in general? Should they get a
Yeah.
degree,
Right.
self-teach? What do you think they should do?
This is always a hard question because I really think it depends on two things. So
Hmm.
it depends on you, your personality, your learning style, and even something as simple as like your age, right?
Yeah.
Like I can't imagine being fresh out of high school and then taking like, a 9 to 14 week boot camp and then just going straight to work. Like to me, I couldn't imagine like 18, 19, even 20-year-old myself just going straight into the workforce like that.
So
That
true.
experience of critically thinking, writing essays, learning how to express ourselves, like a lot of that for me came through university,
Mm.
my university classes. So, I mean, but at the same time, I always say like school will always be there. So let's say you decide to take a university program. I mean, if you drop out in a year or two and then you end up in a boot camp, there's nothing wrong with that either, right?
Hmm.
And I think the second part too is it really depends on the instructors,
Mm.
and the quality of the instructors isn't really based on whether it's a boot camp or a certificate program or a degree program. I mean, that's just going to vary. So the best way is to try to do as much research as possible. Like, I always try to say, read reviews or even try to reach out to students who have taken those programs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a thing that LinkedIn is good for, is seeing, like you can search, like say there's a particular boot camp you're interested in. You can search that boot camp name and then you can kind of see who has added that to their LinkedIn profile, for example. So then you can kind of reach out to them and say, hey, what was your experience here? And just doing like informational interviews as much as you can. Or if you can see what instructors are in these programs, maybe you can look them up and just kind of see, if they've done YouTube videos or interviews like this or, conference talks, and you can kind of get a feel for what the instructors are like. So that's the part that's always hard, is you kind of don't know until you get there.
Yeah, I think that I've had some experiences in that. Like when I first went to school, I don't think I was as good a student because I didn't realize that you could like drop a class if you didn't think the teacher and you meshed correctly. Like that thought did not enter into my mind. And I remember I went back to school for my master's, and I remember that I signed up for a class, and the first day I was like, I got to drop this class. This person is not the right sort of teacher. And so I'm just going to do poorly. And at that point, I was really concerned about doing well. I'm like, this time I'm going to do extremely well. And, but a lot of the things that you said, like, for example, school was a great place to sort of understand like that process of like learning, distilling, communicating, some of the classes that I didn't think were going to be important, like a lot of the writing, for example, or even the public speaking. Like, who cares about public speaking? It's, just an easy A. And then you're like, I got to present something in front of my boss. Like those things are actually a lot more useful than you think. And I think especially if you're trying to do well, you're going to be having to manage so many things at the same time. Maybe you're taking 3 classes, there's like homework schedules. And then on top of that, maybe if you've got a job, it teaches you, especially I think from like high school, that there's an aspect of organization that needs to be involved. But then again, like maybe if you're a little bit older and you've already been through school, something like a short bootcamp program, you've got the time, you've got a little bit more money, you can set aside like a lot of focus time. Or perhaps like if you're a self-learner, that is good. You watch stuff and you just go try it. That's another approach. And I think you have to do an assessment of, what do you need right now and how do you learn best? And then, go do that. So tell me a little bit about, you've created so many different types of curricula that I'm wondering, how do you decide what to add and what to skip? Like it seems like everybody wants the latest and greatest of everything, but then it's like old 6 months from now. So it didn't even matter that you learn like, everybody learn Angular. And then it's like, forget about jQuery and it's Bootstrap. And it's like, now the new frameworks are like Solid.js and React. And, how do you decide what to put in something like that?
Yeah, that's always hard. And I think I think that's probably why I primarily focus on foundational languages. So even with all these newfangled tools, HTML and CSS is pretty much the same. Like there'll be new features into the language, but in itself, it doesn't really change that much. But I mean, you can't not use any sort of tools. Like say, for example, I've used Google Fonts in my CSS Essential training courses. And I swear that website, the UI, updates every 6 months. So there's always people in the comments that are like, it doesn't look like that anymore. And so I think now what I try to do, if I'm using any sort of tool or framework and stuff, what I try to focus on is how does it work in general? Like, let's go back to the Google Fonts example. Basically, you pick a font, you put it in your little folder, and then you copy the code, right? And so I'm trying to reword it now to say, the UI will change quite often, so it might not look like this in 6 months. But just remember, the basics is you pick a font, blah, blah, blah. And I sort of just try to keep it high level in terms of how it works, and then also make it really clear that you have to be comfortable with change a lot in development. Your favorite tools are going to come and go. Languages are going to change. Websites are going to change. So I just try to kind of instill that You're always going to be learning. Things are always going to be changing, and that's just normal and how it is.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I started this toolbox sort of concept was, and I mentioned it a lot of times at the beginning of my intros for them. I always say the pace of the web is relentless. You don't necessarily need to know the difference between like React and Solid.js and Angular and whatever. What you need to know is what makes this technology relevant, and is it something that you need to pursue because it is going to change and shorten the time to get to your result a lot quicker. It's a lot of things have done that in the industry, like React did that, Angular did that, and other frameworks like Svelte is doing some of that, Astro is doing some of that. It's not important that you understand necessarily everything there is to know about that technology, but I think what those technologies have brought, like the virtual DOM, for example, was something that really destroy jQuery. Like everybody used to use jQuery, but then in a world where the DOM is managed for you, then you don't really need jQuery anymore. You're like, what? It's no longer going to get you there quicker. And so I think that that's the important thing. Like understand what is important about this technology. And at some point, you are going to have to continuously learn, like you said. So what technologies or skills, and I'm not talking about technical things necessarily, do you think people need to know to be successful today? I think you probably touched on some of them with when people were saying you're so good at, at explaining things and getting along with people. I mean, what sort of things do you recommend that people know that to do well?
Right. I think that soft skills is so underrated. You kind of know what, in general, what technical skills that you need.
Yeah.
But I think things that people or they need to understand if they want to be a web developer or be in the tech industry is what I was saying before. There's constant change, so you have to learn how to be uncomfortable. Imposter syndrome is usually more of like when you are accomplished, you have accomplished something, but you don't feel like you're good enough. But if you just are uncomfortable with doing something new, that's fine. And you have to learn how to be uncomfortable. You have to learn how to say, you know what, I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to figure it out, or I'm going to try it. And so, I hear a lot of students say like, one day I'll never have to Google anything again. And you know what, that day is never going to come.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah.
You don't know how to do, right? So you have to learn how to be uncomfortable. You have to be very patient. You have to be very detail oriented, because there's always sort of these little things that you have to do that can be just annoying to someone who hates like granular details. Like, can you imagine, like sometimes I'll have to rename like 10 files, for example. Like it's such a small thing that has nothing to do with technical stuff, but then I'll have to, rename it as something thumbnail, something thumbnail, because you want all your files to be organized and stuff. And so you have to just be patient and just know that there's a lot of mundane activities and stuff you have to do, and you kind of have to enjoy that a little bit. Like,
I wonder when you show people like Stack Overflow, do you wait until like the last day of school and then you tell them like this is what everybody actually uses?
I'm sure I'm pretty sure I tell them pretty early on.
That's
mean, that's something that I usually teach too, is how to find answers, because that's the other thing too, is, you can have friends that you can talk to, you can join groups and stuff, but a lot of times at the end of the day, we have to figure out a lot of the stuff by ourselves. And so one of the most important things to learn is how to find answers, how to search for things. I remember in one of my last newsletters, I actually talked about that. I showed some examples of like, how do I do X in CSS? And I was saying, if you put the language in your search results, that'll help. Or just little things like that. Or Stack Overflow, for example, too. It's always so frustrating when you find the question, but you can't find the answer.
When I used to teach like a class on HTML to beginners, as soon as I would say, listen, this book is already out of date. So it's better for you to learn where to find the answers online. And something like CSS, for example, just changes. Even to this day, we're having new features being added all the time. So don't worry that you are never going to know everything and nobody else does. Even the smartest people in the world, they like Google everything, they Stack Overflow everything. And I think as long as you make sort of like a welcoming, environment where people can feel safe to ask questions, understanding that even the seniors are constantly looking things up. I think it's funny when I have to look up and something up in one of my old courses because I like forgot how to do something in like Bootstrap. It's ridiculous. Yeah. And even I do that.
I was just about to say that there's been many times where I'll go and Google something and then I pop up.
Yeah, like, that's great. That's a great feeling. So you did a course on freelancing, or you did kind of like a segment on getting your first job as a web developer course, which is really good. So you have this chapter on freelancing. When do you recommend that somebody, a developer, a designer, look at that as an option?
Me personally, I would wait until you get some work experience, like at an organization, because I think you need that experience of just kind of knowing how to work with people in general. But then especially if you're just learning, it's really helpful to just learn from other developers who are more senior than you. And so I would say, if it was me personally, actually, I think I waited about 10 years to finally go fully freelance. But I would say even just like a couple of years. But I would always say, take on a couple jobs here and there, even while you're working. Because when you quit your job, you don't want to quit with absolutely nothing. So maybe when you decide it's time for you to move on and become freelance full time, you've actually had a couple clients already, or maybe you have a couple lined up to the point where, now maybe you have too many clients and you can't juggle your full-time job and freelancing. There's always a big discussion of like how younger people are less loyal to their companies and stuff these days. But I always feel like you should always have a plan B. So even if you love your job, do a little freelance just so that you have some other experience on the side. Even if maybe you hadn't planned to go freelance full time, you have this little bit of extra experience that you can build off of if you want to. I mean, I think there are people who go freelance right away. And again, maybe that's a personality thing too. But again, me personally, I think having some experience and also being able to like maybe save up a little bit of money with your regular paychecks, that probably helps too. Like, I always say you should have like an EFIT fund.
Yeah, right.
So even if you love your job, everything's going great, put a little bit aside every month just in case maybe something happens one day, or maybe things just change and you get to the point where you're like, I'm ready to leave. But if you don't have that little nest egg, you can't leave, and now you're kind of stuck, and maybe when you start to feel down, that's going to make it harder for you to find a new job or find new clients or to network and stuff. So I would say a little bit of at least a couple years of experience and a little bit of savings to cushion you while you're trying to find new work.
That's a super good advice. I know I've done, to this day, I have a freelance client that I picked up eons ago that I just never dropped because it's, great work, and it doesn't take an insane amount of time. So one of the other courses that I love is working with Git, where you covered the GUI. Is there a time where you actually go for the GUI instead of the terminal?
I think it kind of goes back to me just being more of a visual person. So say, for example, if I'm branching, for example, I like actually seeing how it's branched and stuff.
I know.
Like it's just represented a little bit more visually. I do like using terminal for sort of basic things like cloning a repo or even like pushing, polling, things where I don't really need to see anything. But again, if I'm branching or if I just want to compare the differences, what did I add, what did I remove, and then it's just all visualized a little bit better for me.
I've seen a couple of super advanced things that you can do with that GUI. Like you can do like a line commit where you're like committing like a single piece of something. And this is why I always go to try to use it, but then I'm like, I'm just going to go back to the terminal.
Remember way back in the day when people were using Dreamweaver and people would have opinions about WYSIWYG editors?
I remember that, yes.
It's kind of like that, where it's like, well, I could do the git commands, or as you were mentioning, if you wanted to just commit like a piece of a file, for example, right? So when you're using a GUI, you can basically just say, I can't remember what the actual button or whatever, but you can basically just click off the things that you don't want to add. And then you just put add.
That's crazy. Yeah. See, that's where I think it beats it. Like in the individual, like the very specific commits, I think it would be so superior. And it's like every now and then I like, I'm just going to go for the GUI now. So you also did a course on CSS design systems and architectures, which I thought was awesome. Like, when do you think it's a good time to reach into something like that? And do you introduce that, in school, like in the curricula that you do, or do you think that's something like more advanced for after people have kind of learned the basics?
I think it should be introduced early, actually, because when you think about design systems, it's more about writing thoughtful CSS, because now you're thinking about how to actually organize it. So I definitely think, you want to teach sort of the basics and stuff at first, because you don't want to throw too many new things at beginners. And I also feel like you have to understand the pain points before you can fix it. So you have to work with a CSS file that's a mess before you can think of like, how can I organize this so that it makes sense, or like if someone else is coming in, we can both write together, or I can just leave it as is and someone else can pick up where I left off. And so it doesn't really make sense unless you've had to deal with the flip side of that, which is like,
right.
Everything's all over the place, even the formatting is off, there's, duplicate code and stuff. And so you kind of have to understand what you're fixing before you fix it. But I definitely think it should be introduced early, because then it'll help build good habits earlier on.
It definitely saves you when you're building very large things to have like an organizational concept and methods, and it's not, maybe people who are just building smaller websites, it's not as important, but it definitely saves your data. So, all right, it's time to get into the very controversial stuff. So what's your opinion about some of these new utility first frameworks like Tailwind CSS?
Okay, so I've always maintained the same opinion of it. And so I always say that tools and frameworks should be there to help you, but it shouldn't be a crutch for missing knowledge. So it makes sense that I think you said something earlier, like something like a quicker way to get to the end or something like that. We were talking about something else. So I think that if you are using something like Tailwind, because you're just like, I just want to get this up and done quickly, it makes sense. But if I've definitely had people in my course, in my CSS Essential Training course, will say something like, why don't you just use Bootstrap? Right. And the thing is, you cannot replace a framework with the foundational knowledge. And so I think you need to understand that first before you can use the tool. Because then, let's say you're using Tailwind or Bootstrap, and then something doesn't work. You don't know how to fix it. Or something doesn't, you want to maybe customize it a little bit more. But then you don't know, because all you've been doing is copying and pasting snippets. But if you already have you don't even have to be an expert, but at least as long as you understand the foundation of how it works, and you're like, I just don't want to spend all this time writing all this code when all these badges are already created for me, all these grids are already created for me, that's fine. But if you are saying, why do I need to learn CSS when I can just use one of these frameworks? That's going to be a problem, I think.
Yeah, I think Tailwind itself is controversial, but I think your concept is solid. Back in the way old days where we were editing the templates like directly, the entire site would go down because somebody forgot to close like a tag, because they would be editing like the HTML. Just imagine like the homepage of like a website just going down because somebody forgot to close something. Yeah, you have to understand the basics, but then maybe something like Bootstrap on a smaller project can help you get there quicker. And then if you're using like maybe component-based architectures, then something like Tailwind makes more sense. I'm like afraid of the people that just go like straight into React without knowing JavaScript. It's crazy.
Yeah, so like that's wild to me.
So what about the backend? Like, we talk about these days of front-end and back-end developer and full-stack developer. I mean, do you think there's even such a thing as a pure like front-end? How much do front-end developers need to know these days about some of the other things?
I think it depends on what you focus on too. So, if you are a React developer using these other JavaScript frameworks, I mean, technically it's front-end because it's JavaScript based, but it mimics a lot of stuff we used to rely on backend for. So I think that if you really like hone in on sort of like the JavaScript libraries, maybe you don't really need to know that much backend because you're kind of already implementing that with these libraries. But if you were to do something like maybe you develop Shopify themes, for example, right? The Shopify themes are written in Liquid, which are Ruby based. And so you could be a front end developer who does Shopify themes, but you're going to have to understand a little bit about how Ruby works and the structures and stuff at least. You don't have to be a full-on Ruby developer, but at least know how to tweak it and stuff if you are, or not even if you are a template developer, but even if, you're just setting up Shopify sites for your clients or something, and your client says, oh, I want to add, X feature that's not in the theme, then you can go in there and kind of tweak a little bit, but you'll need to understand.
I think you have to think about it also in terms of value. Connecting to things is going to be a core sort of skill that you need to develop in some way. So understanding like SQL or, NoSQL database. But if you can also be just as well a super strong designer, you should be doing more design because that's really what you're gifted at. A lot of developers, they don't even like making stuff look good. They just want it to work well. And so you have to find your place, but then attempt to be a little flexible.
Well, I think you brought up a good point. I mean, the conversation is always like, should front-end developers know back-end? Should back-end developers know front-end? But we don't really talk enough about, like, should developers understand maybe design a little bit? Because
they should.
With me being sort of just like more of a visual person, I applied that to when I was working as a developer. So a lot of times, the designers would love me because I would make it look exactly like the mockup. Whereas maybe there's a reason why they chose 12 pixels of space rather than 10 or whatever, right? And so for them, they can see that difference. But if you are a person who's just like, oh, it works, and you don't really care about what it looks like, you're going to give it like 15 pixels padding and think it's fine. And the designer's like, no, it needs to be 10, right? And so I think there is definitely value in developers understanding some basics in design as well, or at least, try to make it look like the thing that was given to you.
And what's so funny is that developers and designers both are apologetic about each other's jobs. Like I know some fantastic, like super talented developers, and they're always like, forgive my poor design skills. And I'm like, listen, don't worry. Like you're getting it. Your value is in understanding your part. And if you recognize that somebody else can do this other part, they're equally as valuable in putting something that's great together. So let's talk about some of the we talked about how CSS changes all the time. This really annoys me because I'm always like doing a course and something happens, like I'm recording and they change something and I'm like, are you kidding me? So what are you excited about some of these upcoming features of CSS?
I think anything that I consider new isn't even that new anymore. It's just, it wasn't there when I got started. Like say, for example, I just recently did like a short YouTube video on how to use CSS variables, which isn't really that new. I think it's been maybe 6-7 years or something that it was first introduced, but it was new to me because I've always used Sass to sort of extend those features. And so I was like, let me look into this because I've seen people use it and I'm like, hey, this is actually pretty cool. And when I did the short video, there was some people who were like, this is great. I'm going to start using this right away. So I'm kind of, I guess, excited to see these more like features that we had to use things like Sass to extend. Like it would be nice if the actual CSS language did that. So to me, I think like adding the CSS variables is kind of a start to seeing it. I don't want it to become totally like a programming language because that's what I like about CSS, but I do want to see some more of those kinds of features like, nesting, the declaration blocks, and like I said, variables, and just finding ways to sort of make things more reusable and extendable for CSS.
Yeah.
And also just kind of using like grid and Flexbox more. Like it's new to me just because it's anything that's like less than 10 years old is new to me.
It's really amazing that you mentioned Sass because I am a firm believer in that. Sass was so awesome. It's been around for 15 years. I was looking at some surveys about user satisfaction and it's extremely high for Sass. So I'm not sure that CSS variables are ever going to be the same.
Yeah, I'm definitely not ready to give up Sass. And I've definitely seen the discussion of people saying, we don't need this anymore. But I'm like, it's just variables. There's still a whole bunch of things that's still missing though. But I like the where it's going. I think there's kind of like the possibilities of where what will be added next.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool, exciting things like layers and stuff are pretty interesting. They are looking to install like a parent selector. And you mentioned a
Mhm.
grid and Flexbox. So, what are your thoughts between like grid and Flexbox? When should somebody use one over the other?
Well, the main distinction that I usually think about when I decide which one I want to use is Flexbox basically works in one direction. So either you lay out things in rows or you lay things out in columns. So let's say I'm just doing like a basic layout where I have the content in the middle and maybe there's a left sidebar that has like the menu stuff and then maybe the right sidebar has, extra information. Flexbox would be great for that because you're basically just making like three columns and maybe you have a header and a footer. So something very basic. But grid, you can align things on rows and columns. So that's more if you want a more complex layout. So if you want, remember how we used to actually make grid layouts with CSS,
Oh,
like
yeah.
floating and stuff, right? And when we would do those 12 column layouts and stuff.
Heck, heck.
So
I
basically,
used to do
anytime you,
table layout, so I am like a
oh,
dinosaur.
so you know the
Oh,
table layouts,
oh
the
my
12
gosh.
column layouts. So if you feel the need, and I guess this might make more sense for people who, have developed that had written CSS in the past. But if you feel like you need that 12 column layout sort of idea, then grid would probably work best. But generally, I think for me personally, I always try to do it in Flexbox first because it's a little more simple. And if I find that I'm like, oh, I can't get this to be where I want it to be, then I'll try to switch over to grid.
That's a good point, and I think that sometimes
Mm-hmm.
too, like grid is better for some things, and I think that that's the
Mm-hmm.
key. Like you have to know when things are better, and that's when you should
Mm-hmm.
use them. Because I feel
Yeah.
like yeah, if it's not, if it's not broke, then I don't want to spend a bunch of time trying to get my
Right.
slide ruler out and figuring out when I have to like grid something
Yeah.
else, and like having all the how you have to like write all the exceptions to like, okay, what if somebody
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have this feature, and it drives me
Mm-hmm.
crazy. So cool. Also,
Yeah.
tell me, how can somebody find you? What sort of, I mean, you mentioned a lot of different things. You said a YouTube
Yeah.
channel, you have a newsletter. So how can people find
Yep.
you today?
The easiest way is probably just ChristinaTruong.com because at least I have links to these various things on there. Or you can just look me up on YouTube, Decoded by Christina,
That's great.
and
Yeah. And they're obviously LinkedIn, of course. I mean, that's usually where I
LinkedIn, of
find a
course.
lot of
Yep.
people. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I love these conversations. You learn so much, and I don't know. Maybe one day we'll go like in a three-way battle with Morton to see and talk
Yes.
about Flexbox and Grid and see how that works.
Yep.
So super, I have the benefit of seeing those several times, the talks that I have with people, because I have to edit them, and then afterwards I end up watching them again, and then I see them again during this show. So that is really cool. And I get to make all the. I think I talk too much. That's one of my nervous things when when I'm nervous, I tend to talk a lot. This is where I think a lot of developers aren't necessarily, natural with people, and I think that's how it comes out for me. Uh, so I have Christina. Let's see if I can bring her on, and we can go through some of the questions. We really had a ton of questions asked during, the little show. So how is it going, Christina? Are you there?
Good. How are you?
Super good. I am so excited. That was such a great conversation. It was better like the second time I saw it and the third time. I think it's a little bit better once you shorten it a bit. So we had a lot of comments on the chat. So I really picked up on a lot of things. When I was looking through your stuff, I realized how many courses you've already done on LinkedIn. So that was pretty cool. And I looked at like the traffic that you've gotten for like CSS Essential Training. It's like 176,000 people that have
Yeah.
watched your show. How does that feel?
Well, actually, it's been a lot more
Oh, has it?
because
Oh,
prior to this
oh,
version,
you are correct.
the initial one was like a three-part series. I think it was released in like 2017 or so, and then yeah, but
That's great.
it's yeah, it's
You
wild
are
that so many people are taking it.
I do remember it being broken into three, so you're right. Then they kind of
Hmm.
combined it back again, so you like lost that
Yeah,
traffic. That's not even
yeah,
from a long time ago. So obviously,
but
you
that's
have a
fine.
lot of really cool stuff, and I mean, I loved a lot of the other stuff that you had on like Git. I really, I asked, does any developers use a lot of visual tools? And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, well, I really love the terminal, and I remember talking to you about that. And then I realized I actually do end up using a lot of tools. So, for example, like I love this thing called Kaleidoscope. Let's see,
Hmm.
I don't know if you've seen it, but it's this thing called Kaleidoscope that I use, and it's just really like a diffing tool whenever I want to see
Mm.
the difference between two kinds of code. So that's one way in which I do something visual. I love it because when I'm doing courses, it's really useful to see, like, when I'm recording, if I type what I thought I should have typed, and even when I'm taking courses, it's good to see the diffs. So I thought that was pretty cool. And one of the most popular Visual Studio Code plugins is this thing called Git Lens. A lot of developers use this just because it really turbocharges what Visual Studio Code can do. In a way, it's kind of like a visual Git tool. It's not the GitHub tool, the GitHub GUI itself. And then I found this other thing called Sublime Merge. That if you love Sublime Text, one of the really super popular old editors, so they just released something called Sublime Merge, which is kind of like a visual tool for committing things. So the thing that I was talking to you about is this line by line staging that the GUI tools let you do that is really powerful. And
Hmm.
you can do it, I think, with the terminal, but it's just much easier to just
Hmm.
do the do it in a visual way. And I think like seeing the commits and visualizing like what the branches are doing, that's all I think something better
Hmm.
that the GUI tools will do. So, you know, I'm telling you, like every 6 months I go, I gotta check out that GUI tool. It's gonna make me so happy. And then I
Hmm.
just like get frustrated. So I must make myself, I think one of my secrets in learning things is just make myself, like force myself to do something. So maybe I'll do that, like just force myself. Maybe I'll do a course where I'm only using the GUI. So I'm gonna have to ask you for some tips later on.
Sure.
So, so we had a lot of really good stuff on the chat. Let's see if I can pull up some stuff. Let's see. Let's see. We have also some little kudos from Marina. Love this topic. Great speakers. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm super glad that I know a lot of awesome people so that I can, whether it's me or other people that I know can call upon. Like it's like you have the phone number for Batman and you could just like who's the best person on CSS, and Batman like has to show up because they're nice and like I have the access to that. So that's really actually super powerful. Like and then let's see. So some David asked about CSS. Do you think Sass is like a must learn? What do you think about that?
I personally use it all the time.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't say it's a must, but it's kind of like all these other tools that we've been talking about. It just kind of helps you do it better. But it might be useful because a particular job you're applying for, maybe they use SAS
Hmm.
at that on their projects. But I'm also seeing a lot of people moving away from SAS recently and just kind of going back to regular CSS or like JavaScript CSS. And I have feelings about that. I think I'm going to say basically what I always say is at least just try it and see if you like it. And if it works for you, then use it. And if it doesn't, then don't.
Yeah, totally. And I think more than anything, you're gonna find that your company might already be using it. Like if you join a company, it has a really high usage rate, and it's almost like React today. It's hard to almost find the job that doesn't want you to have some sort of
Mhm.
React background. So knowing it will be fantastic, and I think you'll find that it's powerful enough that CSS hasn't quite caught onto it. So I know there was like some questions on, for example, some of the new features that
Mhm.
happen. So let's see, because I haven't tried this before. I have like these different views that I've never used before. Oh, look at that. We're in the corner. Yeah. So somebody asked about the parent selector, which is called has in CSS, as to, are we going to get a parent selector in 2023? Well, it's already out. I mean, you could see the support is not the greatest
Right.
everywhere yet, but hopefully it'll get there. I'm always upset when they call things, uh, they sort of confuse the issue by not calling them what
Yeah.
Sass already called them for years. So in
Yeah.
Sass, you're used to like the ampersand being the parent
Hmm.
selector. But guess what? They screwed that up by using the ampersand on nesting selector. So like in the plan to
Oh.
use nesting, they're actually using the ampersand. And so that's just like, I think when developers get too creative,
Hmm.
and I think I mentioned that I don't like how variables are called custom properties because everybody knows them as
Hmm.
variables. Like, why did you
It's
have
so
to? And I know that
confusing.
they do more, but I
Hmm.
think people get confused with that. I don't know what you think about that.
I feel the same way because on my YouTube channel, I did a short, like, I have this thing called Decoded by Christina Minutes, where
Hmm.
I explain something in 2 minutes or less. But when I was trying to title the video, I'm like, because I want to use the proper naming for it, but I'm like, do people even understand if I say custom properties? So I think I ended up just putting like CSS variables in brackets, just so
Sure.
that people can understand, like, this is what we're talking about. We're so used to these things being called variables, just call it variables.
Right, I'm with you on that. So let's see. We have some other stuff in here. That really interesting that I asked a question about what was the one course that you took in college that you didn't think was going to be useful? And I never expected Paulo saying that he actually enjoyed assembler. His assembler class was actually his favorite thing. And I did take an assembler class in college, I remember, and I didn't do very well, and it was just too sort of like I don't know, I don't know if it was boring, but I'm like, what the actual heck is even going on? Because you have to like add all these registers, and it feels like somebody you had a car, and then somebody just gave you like one wheel to work with, and it's like, okay, here's the raw wheel, do something with it. But I thought that his insight was pretty cool, like understanding how hardware is controlled and how it works helped me better understand programming in general. That was actually a really smart thing to learn. Like I feel like I
Mhm.
hated that class, so I'm glad. I didn't expect that. I took like public speaking, or I took a film class in
Mhm.
college, which was fantastic. I mean, you did do a lot of psychology classes. Do you remember anything that was like really odd that you took that you're like, wow, this is amazing?
Uh, truthfully, I don't remember much. That was like
Oh,
10 years ago, 15 years ago. I don't know. It's been a while.
so you got to
It's kind
remember,
of all
I
a
I
blur.
started out with like a degree in journalism, and I remember that in the journalism school, I took a class on logic, and I didn't know that I was going to be more of a developer. Like I thought I was going to be more of a designer. But I always like whenever I'm in arguments, I always pull my logic class. And it's kind of
Hmm.
useful for programming too, but there's always like something. I took these crazy classes in college. The film class
Hmm.
was fun. I took a class on something like Canadian geography, and I've only been to Canada like a couple of times. All I remember learning is that there is an unnaturally large amount of golf courses in Canada, because the guy that was teaching the class, the only map that he had at the time was like a map with all the golf courses. So whenever he talked about the geography, he was like showing where all the golf courses are, and that like really stuck to my mind. So
That's
and
interesting
somebody,
considering. Oh, sorry.
yeah, go
I
ahead,
was
yeah.
going to say that's interesting considering most of Canada is generally cold most of the
Yeah.
time. So I'm
Maybe
thinking
it's
you
like
don't
all the
get to play
water.
golf all year round, right?
I think it was like the all the water. Like maybe it makes like good
Hmm.
water. I mean, I don't know enough about golf. I've only played it twice, but
Hmm.
maybe it's like all the water traps. Because that's the other thing I learned. There's like water everywhere in that country. It's crazy. So yeah, I don't know. It's like with weird class you take. I think take sometimes they don't work out. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe at some point I'll be huge into golfing. So let's see. So interesting. I asked a question about, sort of learning about how often do you learn things, and so Micah posted something about I just got my first developer job, but my goal is to learn how often do you learn something? Because one thing that was interesting about the developer survey that I showed you was
Mhm.
that most developers do 72% of developers code as a hobby, and I didn't realize that like I do that. Like whenever I'm like sort of odd. Like whenever I have some free time, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get into this like new thing. I want to try this cool technique out or something. I don't know if you've had that same thing, but people really responded to that, where it seemed that people really take their learning seriously, which is one of the things that you were mentioning, that it's important
Mhm.
for you to kind of develop that attitude of learning.
I think I did it more early in my career, especially just because, I mean, you're just beginning, so you just want to learn everything. And these days, it's kind of more of like on an as needed basis. Like, for example, when I was redesigning my site, I started off just like, I was like, I don't feel like learning any new frameworks or whatever, because I was using Jekyll before. And then when I got a new iMac, there was some dependency or something that just wasn't working anymore. And I was just like, oh, I can't be bothered. And then I was going to switch to 11. And then same thing. I was like, I don't feel like learning right now, which is ironic for a teacher to say that. Um, so then I ended up just creating like this static site. So when I updated it last night, actually, this last couple of days, I updated my site. I was like, let me just force myself to just switch it over to 11, because if I don't do it now, I won't ever learn it. And so now I think now that I'm sort of later in my career, it's on a very as needed basis. Like if I don't have to do it, or I'm working on a project or something that just kind of forces me to do it, I just won't, because now I have so many old habits to fall back
Hmm.
on. It's kind of like if it ain't broke,
Yeah,
then
you're right. A lot.
don't
I
fix
think
it,
it's
right?
like CSS is like sort of, CSS and even JavaScript in a way has kind of like stabilized, especially maybe CSS, to where do you
Hmm.
really need to know how to do like CSS layers, which is another kind of new thing that is just coming out? You probably don't. So I love 11T. That's another that my actual
Hmm.
blog is actually done in 11T. So that's
Hmm.
a good thing to learn. And I think at some point though, yeah, you do realize that okay, it's time to move along and find something interesting that's
Hmm.
new. And I'm in the process of like switching actually my 11T site to like Astro and Svelte, and like
Hmm.
I'm like, of course it's never gonna happen because there's always some other shiny thing. But my big plan is like as usual, I'm trying to learn too much. Like, it's not just, okay, well, I'll just install a plugin onto 11T. No, let's just like redo everything. With every piece of new technology that I want to learn. So, all right, we'll take one more question here because I think it's pretty awesome. And then we can be done. We're a little bit over time, so I hope you don't mind. And it's from Jorge. He's saying, what about design system? I'm working with a cells, atoms, organism templates, all world words and design system because we work in a company with 3 brands, really class names. So you do a whole entire course on design systems. What are your thoughts? Like what? And I have seen this sort of like concept of like atomic design. I don't quite understand it because I feel like I'm in the spectrum. I'm like tilt a little more towards the developer side. And we did, I think. I don't know if we got into like BEM and SMACSS. Like what are your thoughts
Hmm.
on kind of the state of how somebody should approach something like that really
Yeah.
quickly, I guess, in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think especially if you're working on a large company, in a large company, but I think Jorge said that there was 3 brands, long class names. So I think whether your project is small, and especially if it's large, you have to start thinking about design systems is basically thinking about how you can organize things into reusable modules. So say, for example, if you have a color branding system, you kind of have to think about how do we organize all the colors. If you're constantly using components over and over again, how do we create this so that the naming structure is the same? If I need a card layout, then how do we plan that so that all I have to do is just use one class name card or something like that? I mean, you're basically, a design system is basically building your own framework, because something like a Bootstrap may not work for you because you have to add your own company's branding into it. You have to add your own company's designs into it. Or maybe you just don't like their naming system. So it's just BEM and SMACSS is a good way to start because it makes you think about thoughtful naming conventions. It makes you think about modularizing reusable bits and stuff. And I even do that for basic projects like my own website, for example. It's a very basic page, but I apply those same principles to it. And I think that's also where something like Sass might come in handy, just because it allows you to create like variables and mix-ins, and it just makes it a little bit easier to reuse stuff than just plain CSS.
Yeah, I feel like when you need a design system, once your
Mm-hmm,
site gets, it's like harder to try to update it because
mm-hmm,
things are so big or you have so many pages. I worked at some
mm-hmm,
pretty large sites, and that's what happens. Like when your
mm-hmm,
site gets so unruly, or you're working with enough people that
mm-hmm,
you everybody needs to be on the same page, that's when something like that becomes super useful.
mm-hmm.
So thank you so much, Christina. I appreciate the interview as well as taking the time to just answer questions and coming back on the chat. I'm not sure that everybody's going to be able to do both the interview and the chat, but I appreciate you answering the questions and just talking to you. Hopefully, we can do this again. I'm telling you, I'm still down for the Morton, Christina, Ray, CSS. We'll ask him about
Showdown.
because we are Morton and I are very different. So I don't know. I think he maybe he can bring somebody in and.
Mm-hmm,
I know that you're like kind of in the same page with me as Sass. So I think he
mm-hmm.
leans more towards CSS variables. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be awesome. All right. Well,
Thanks
I'll
for
talk to you
having me.
later. Yeah, awesome.
I'll
Thank you
talk to
so
you too.
much.
All right.
All right. So a couple of other things. I'm going to be off for the next couple of weeks and then I'll be back. So this is actually why I wanted to do Christina's interview today. Because I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks, so I wasn't going to have any content. So I wanted to do that for sure. And yeah, so I have an interview that I'm going to be having this Friday with Carlos Solis. So if you haven't met him, it's going to be pretty awesome. So Carlos does a lot of stuff. He's kind of a newer author, and he's talking about mono repos, GitHub packages. So I'm really excited to talk to him because those are like super like advanced geeky topics that I feel like I'm not that good with. So it'll be cool to sort of do something that's on the bleeding edge with somebody that's much more knowledgeable about that sort of thing. So I can't wait to see that. Thanks again for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.